She was sitting on the hood of my rusted 1974 Cortina, her boots scuffing the frozen metal, blowing into her cupped hands to fight off the biting London cold. My name is Arthur. I am 89 years old today. If you had told the younger version of me that I would spend a freezing Tuesday afternoon sharing a cheap thermos of instant coffee with Agnetha Fältskog, entirely away from the screaming crowds and the blinding stadium lights, I would have said you were completely out of your mind. But it happened. And the way it happened, well, I still wake up in the middle of the night, smelling the damp wool of her coat. Before the winter of 1979, my life was a relentless shade of gray. I was a 42-year-old archivist working in the windowless basement of a municipal library. My days were measured in the smell of decaying paper, the dust motes dancing under flickering fluorescent tubes, and the heavy, suffocating silence of an empty apartment waiting for me at the end of the bus line. The world outside felt just as cold and unforgiving. The late 70s in England were defined by strikes, power cuts, and piles of uncollected rubbish freezing on the pavement. I wore the same brown tweed jacket every single day, the elbows wearing thin, my hands always carrying the faint metallic stain of newspaper ink. I spoke to perhaps 3 people a week, and usually just to exchange pleasantries about the terrible weather. I was fading into the background of my own existence, a ghost moving through a city that barely acknowledged I was there. There was no color in my routine. There was no music in my head. I would eat cold baked beans directly from the tin, staring at the frost creeping up my single-pane window, feeling the heavy, physical weight of absolute crushing anonymity. But I had no idea that a Monday, miserable walk to a corner shop to buy a box of matches would completely shatter the silent walls of my reality. I pushed the heavy glass door of the local newsagent, the brass bell ringing sharply above my head, shaking the snow from my collar. And there it was, spilling out from a battered transistor radio sitting behind the counter. It was the song SOS. Not the upbeat rhythm that most people tap their feet to, but the voice, Agnetha's voice. It pierced straight through the stale air that smelled of cheap tobacco and damp newsprint. There was a desperate, pleading melancholy in her tone that hit me right in the center of my chest. I stood frozen in the narrow aisle, a box of matches slipping through my numb fingers and clattering against the linoleum floor. I bought the record that very same day. I bought a second-hand player. My small, dark living room suddenly filled with this crystalline, agonizingly pure sound. She wasn't just singing pop songs. She was channeling a very specific kind of northern loneliness that I recognized deep in my own bones. I spent the next 2 years collecting every magazine, every imported clipping, tracking the subtle sadness in her blue eyes even when she was smiling brightly for the television cameras. She became the solitary anchor in my drifting life. So when a local radio station announced a contest to act as a local driver for the band's management during their London tour stop, I poured my entire soul into writing the winning letter. I thought the fantasy would end there, a silly letter sent by a lonely man, until the telephone violently broke the silence of my apartment. The voice on the phone told me I had won. I was instructed to report to the service entrance of their hotel on Tuesday morning. And then the sky fell. The worst blizzard we had seen in a decade hit the city on Monday night. I woke up at 4 a.m. to absolute terrifying silence. No traffic, no movement. I looked out my window and saw 3 feet of snow burying the streets, illuminated by the orange glow of the street lamps. The buses were canceled. The trains were frozen solid on the tracks. My chest tightened until I couldn't draw a breath. I grabbed my keys and ran down the stairs, my boots slipping on the black ice, only to find my Cortina dead under a mountain of white. I turned the key, the engine gave one pathetic metallic click, and died. The temperature was 10 degrees below freezing. The hotel was 9 miles away across the paralyzed city. Panic clawed at my throat, tasting like copper. I was watching the only bright spark of my life being suffocated by the snow. My boss called from the library, threatening to fire me on the spot if I didn't show up to check the heating pipes, warning me I'd be destitute if I walked away. I looked at the heavy black receiver in my hand, looked at the howling snowstorm outside, and made a reckless decision that forced me into the most brutal physical test I had ever endured. I walked. I pulled my thin tweed collar up against the violent slashing wind, wrapped a moth-eaten woolen scarf around the lower half of my face, and stepped into the snowdrifts. The freezing air burned my lungs like swallowed glass. My toes went completely numb within the first mile. The city was a ghost town, white and howling, the wind whipping tears from my eyes before they could even freeze on my cheeks. Every single step required physically lifting my leg out of knee-deep snow. By mile 5, my vision was blurring with exhaustion. By mile 7, my legs were trembling uncontrollably, and my coat was heavily soaked with frozen moisture. But I kept hearing that crystalline voice in my head, pushing me forward through the blinding white. When I finally reached the grand iron gates of the hotel, it was pure chaos. Even in the deadly blizzard, hundreds of fans were huddled together, screaming, holding wet cardboard signs, their collective breath rising in massive plumes of steam. The noise was physically deafening. I pushed through the wet, heavy wool coats of the crowd, smelling nervous sweat, cheap floral perfume, and desperate anticipation. I shoved my frozen, crumpled confirmation letter at the security guard. He looked at my blue lips, shook his head in disbelief, and unclipped the velvet rope. I was inside. The heavy oak door shut behind me, instantly cutting off the roar of the crowd. But what I saw when I turned around completely stopped my heart. She was standing entirely alone in the dim service corridor, hiding, not the glamorous, untouchable icon in glittering spandex, but a visibly exhausted woman wearing a heavy, oversized winter coat, nervously picking at the cuticle of her thumb. The management team was in an absolute panic about the storm, the ruined schedules, the failing logistics. They barely looked at me, tossed me the keys to a running rental car out back, and told me to get her to the venue's loading dock, far away from the madness out front. We walked out to the alley. The silence inside that car was heavy, thick with tension. I offered her the thermos of cheap coffee I had packed hours ago in my own kitchen. We sat there, the engine ticking as it tried to warm up, the heater blowing weak, lukewarm air against the frosted windshield. She took the plastic cup with both hands just to warm her freezing fingers. I looked at her profile. Her golden hair was tucked carelessly under a plain gray knit hat. I saw the fine, tired lines around her eyes, the real human exhaustion of being hunted by the eyes of the world. We didn't talk about music. We talked about the snow. She told me about the silent, endless winters in Jönköping. Her voice was soft, slightly raspy, completely devoid of the studio echo I knew so intimately. It was just two cold, tired people sitting in a rusted car. Then she turned her pale blue eyes directly to me, let out a long, heavy sigh, and whispered something about her life that I was never prepared to hear. She leaned her head against the cold glass of the passenger window, her breath fogging the pane, and said, "Sometimes I wish I could just walk into the snow and disappear. Just be ordinary for a single afternoon." The weight of her words completely crushed me. Here I was, a man who had spent his entire life invisible, desperate to be seen, sitting inches away from a woman who was seen by millions, desperately begging to be invisible. We finally drove to the venue in silence. She smiled a sad, genuine smile, thanked me for the coffee, gently squeezed my damp shoulder, and stepped out of the car, instantly swallowed by the blinding flashbulbs and the screaming masses. The management thrust a 50-pound note into my hand and sent me away. The job was done. I walked the 9 miles back home that night in the pitch dark. The snow was still falling heavily, but the cold didn't bite my skin anymore. I opened the door to my apartment, turned on the single weak lamp, and looked around at my dusty, quiet life. But it didn't feel like a prison anymore. It felt like a sanctuary. That single afternoon in the freezing car broke the illusion forever. The goddess I worshipped was just a tired girl from Sweden who desperately missed the quiet. And my quiet, invisible life suddenly felt like a rare privilege I had never fully appreciated. But there was one physical piece of proof from that day that I carried home in my coat pocket, something I have never shown another living soul. My hands shake a little these days. The arthritis makes it hard to hold on to small things. It's the cheap, white plastic lid of the thermos cup she drank from. There is a faint, faded smudge of her pale pink lipstick still clinging to the rim, hardened and preserved by 47 years of time. I sit here in my worn leather armchair, listening to the clock ticking on the wall, and I just look at it. The world remembers Agnetha Fältskog as a shining, spinning star in a pristine white jumpsuit, immortalized on heavy vinyl and bright film. But I remember the distinct smell of wet wool, the sound of the heater rattling in that freezing car, and the tired, beautiful sigh of a woman who just wanted to be ordinary for a few minutes. We spend our entire lives looking up at the bright stars, wishing we could touch them, completely forgetting that those stars are burning themselves up from the inside. That frozen Tuesday in 1979 didn't just give me a story to tell. It gave me peace. It taught me that there is immense dignity in the quiet shadows of the world. I am 89 years old, and my life was profoundly, beautifully ordinary. And looking back, I wouldn't trade my silence for all the roaring crowds in the world.